It is September 20th, 1187, and Saladin's army has just arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem. 3 months earlier, at Hattin, he destroyed the Crusader field army in a single afternoon. In the weeks that followed, city after city fell without a serious fight. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Caesarea, Ascalon. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had stood for nearly 90 years, had collapsed in the course of a single summer. Only Jerusalem remained, and Jerusalem was full. 60,000 refugees had poured into the city from the fallen territories. The streets were choked with people who had nowhere left to go. The treasury was nearly empty. The garrison was so thin that the city's commander, Balian of Ibelin, the highest-ranking lord to survive Hattin, had been forced to knight 60 squires and common citizens just to have enough men to defend the walls. What happens in the next 12 days will determine not just the fate of 60,000 people, but the moral character of a civilization. And it will come down to a single conversation between 2 men who, against all expectation, respected each other. The stakes at Jerusalem in September 1187 are not simply military, they are civilizational on both sides. For the Christian world, Jerusalem is not a city. It is the reason the Crusades exist. It is the place where Christ was crucified and resurrected. It is the city that Crusaders from across Europe had marched thousands of miles and died to reach in 1099. Losing it is not just a military defeat, it is a theological catastrophe, proof to many that God has withdrawn his favor from the Christian enterprise in the Holy Land. For the Muslim world, Jerusalem is equally sacred. It is the city of prophets. It is Al-Quds, the holy. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock stand on the same ground where, in Islamic tradition, the Prophet ascended to heaven. To reclaim Jerusalem is not just a political victory. For Saladin, who has spent his entire career framing his wars as holy, it is the culmination of everything. And yet, the way Jerusalem is taken, with massacre or with mercy, will define how both worlds see themselves for centuries. Saladin knows this, and Balian, standing inside the walls with his 60 new knights and 60,000 refugees, is about to use that knowledge as his only weapon. To understand what is happening at Jerusalem in September 1887, you need to understand who Balian of Ibelin is and the extraordinary agreement he made with Saladin before entering the city. Balian was one of the senior lords of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had fought at Hattin and survived, one of the very few senior nobles to escape the field alive. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, with the kingdom collapsing around him, he had retreated to Tyre, the one major coastal city that had not fallen. His wife, Maria Komnenon, the former queen of Jerusalem by her first marriage, was still in Jerusalem with their children. He asked Saladin for safe conduct to retrieve them. Saladin agreed, on 2 conditions. Balian would stay in Jerusalem for only 1 night, and he would not take up arms against the Sultan. Balian gave his word. Saladin honored the agreement completely, not only granting safe passage, but arranging a personal armed escort to take Maria and the children safely to Tripoli before the siege began. He sent Balian's family to safety, while Balian was still inside the city he had promised not to defend. Then the people of Jerusalem found out Balian was there. The Patriarch Heraclius, Queen Sibylla, and the entire terrified population fell on their knees before him. They begged, they pleaded, They told him that without him 60,000 people would die or be enslaved. The patriarch offered to absolve him of his oath, to take the spiritual burden of the broken promise onto the church. Balian wrote to Saladin, explaining what had happened. He apologized. He said the circumstances had made keeping his oath impossible. He asked Saladin's understanding. Saladin replied that he felt no ill will. He said he understood. And then he assembled his siege engines. The state of Jerusalem's defenses when Balian took command was close to hopeless. The city had fewer than 14 knights, in a garrison defending walls that stretched for miles against an army that numbered in the tens of thousands. 14 armored cavalry were not a force, they were a symbol of how completely Hattin had destroyed not just an army, but the entire military infrastructure of the kingdom. Balian did what he could. He knighted 60 men from the ranks of the squires, knights in training, and from among the wealthier citizens of the city. These were men who knew how to fight, who had trained for this, but who had not yet earned the formal rank. Balian gave it to them now, because the city needed bodies on the walls more than it needed ceremony. He organized the food stores, the water supply, the treasury. He assessed what was left after months of wealthy residents fleeing with their assets. He posted his makeshift garrison at the walls and began the work of turning 60,000 frightened refugees into something that could survive a siege. Outside, Saladin's army took its positions on September 20th. The Sultan himself initially attempted one final negotiation, a peaceful surrender, generous terms, safe passage for everyone. The defenders rejected it. They would not hand over Jerusalem without a fight. The city was too holy, the symbolism was too heavy, and perhaps simply they did not yet believe they had no other choice. Saladin had promised after that rejection to take the city by force. He was a man who kept his promises. The assault began. For the first 6 days, the defenders held. Saladin's initial assaults against the northern walls were repulsed. The defenders, outnumbered, exhausted, fighting from improvised positions, managed to turn back attack after attack. The walls of Jerusalem were strong, built and rebuilt over centuries, and the people inside them were fighting with the specific ferocity of men and women who have nowhere left to go. On September 26th, Saladin changed his approach. He moved his camp to the northeast, to the Mount of Olives, where the walls were weaker and where there was no major gate that the defenders could use to launch counterattacks. His siege engines, catapults, mangonels, petraries began a concentrated bombardment. Greek fire, volleys of arrows, sappers digging beneath the foundations. On September 29th, a section of wall near the Damascus Gate collapsed. The breach was open. Saladin's forces pushed toward it. The defenders threw themselves into the gap, what was left of them. A few dozen knights and a handful of men-at-arms fighting in the rubble, holding a breach in a wall against an army. The Muslim forces could not break through, but the defenders could not seal the wall. They were simply too few. Inside the city, the population had descended into despair. The clergy organized a barefoot procession around the walls, priests and monks walking in the manner of the First Crusade, praying, singing, asking for a miracle that was not going to come. Mothers cut their children's hair and held them chin-deep in cold water, a ritual preparation for what they feared was coming. By September 30th, Balian understood with complete clarity that the city could not be held. The walls were breached, his garrison was spent, there was no relief force. There would never be a relief force. He rode out to meet Saladin. What passed between Balian of Ibelin and Saladin on September 30th, 1187, became one of the most famous negotiations in medieval history. Balian told Saladin that the city would surrender, but he also told him what would happen if the terms were not acceptable. If Saladin entered Jerusalem by force, if there was no negotiated peace, the defenders would destroy everything. They would slaughter the 5,000 Muslim prisoners held inside the city. They would kill their own families rather than allow them to be enslaved. They would tear down the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa mosque stone by stone. They would burn every treasure in the city. They would leave Saladin a ruin. Saladin had initially refused to negotiate after the defenders rejected his first offer. He had sworn he would take the city by force. His word was his word. But the threat was real. Balian could probably have carried it out, and Saladin, who had framed his entire campaign as the liberation of a sacred city, could not liberate rubble. He could not present to the Muslim world the smoking wreckage of the Dome of the Rock as his great triumph. He agreed to talk. The negotiation that followed was meticulous and human. Saladin's initial demand, 10 dinars ransom for every man, 5 for every woman, 1 for every child. Those who couldn't pay would be enslaved. Balian replied that there were 20,000 people in the city who could never pay that amount. Saladin proposed a collective ransom, 100,000 dinars to free all 20,000. Balian said the city's treasury could not raise such a sum. They negotiated, back and forth, each concession wrung out, each number argued over. In the end, the deal was this. Saladin would free 7,000 of the poor for 30,000 dinars from the city's treasury. 2 women or 10 children would count as 1 man. The rest had 40 days to arrange their ransoms. It was a deal that by the standards of medieval warfare was extraordinarily merciful, and Saladin kept it and went further. On October 2nd, 1187, Balian of Ibelin formally surrendered the city of Jerusalem to Saladin. The date was not accidental. October 2nd corresponded in the Islamic calendar to the 27th of Rajab, the anniversary of the Isra and Miraj, the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem and ascension to heaven. For Saladin, who understood the power of symbol as well as the power of swords, the timing was meaningful. The takeover of the city was, by the standards of 1187, remarkably peaceful. The 30,000 dinars for the 7,000 were paid from the treasury. Saladin's brother Al-Adil approached the Sultan and asked for a gift, 1,000 of the poor who could not pay their ransom, freed as a personal act of charity. Saladin granted it. Then Balian of Ibelin asked for another 1,000. Saladin granted that too. Then the Patriarch asked. Saladin freed those as well. And then Saladin himself announced that all the elderly who could not pay were to be released without ransom. In total, more people were freed without payment than were ransomed through the formal arrangement. Saladin allowed the noblewomen of the city to leave without ransom, including Queen Sibylla, whose husband, King Guy, he held captive. He allowed Queen Dowager Maria, Balian's wife, to leave with full honors. The Muslim holy sites were restored. The great golden cross that the Crusaders had placed over the Dome of the Rock was pulled down. The mosques were reconsecrated. Muslim prisoners held by the Crusaders, close to 3,000 of them, were released. And, against the wishes of his commanders, Saladin left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre standing. He permitted Christian pilgrims to continue visiting the city. He allowed the Eastern Orthodox clergy, who had been suppressed under Latin Christian rule, to resume their practices.
A Muslim chronicler wrote, "The Muslims entered the city and purified it from the filth of the Franks." A Crusader chronicler wrote, "Balian, seeing that the city could not be held, sought mercy, and Saladin granted it, for he was a man of great honor, though our people departed with heavy hearts. Even the enemies agreed on what had happened."
The contrast that defines Jerusalem 1187 was already 88 years old when Saladin stood outside the walls. In 1099, when the First Crusade took Jerusalem, the chroniclers described the aftermath in terms of rivers of blood, Muslims and Jews killed in the streets, in the mosques, in the synagogues. The Crusaders themselves wrote about it with pride. It was, in their telling, the righteous fury of God's warriors. Later historians have debated the scale of the massacre, but the intent and the fact of mass killing are not in dispute. Saladin knew this history. Every Muslim in his army knew it. The argument for repeating it in reverse, for taking back what had been taken in blood with blood, was not a fringe position among his commanders. It was, in many ways, the obvious position, the just position, an eye for an eye, writ in the language of holy war. Saladin chose differently. Whether he chose differently because of Balian's threat, or because of genuine mercy, or because of calculated political wisdom, the desire to present himself to the Muslim world as a ruler of moral authority rather than simple conquest, is something historians still debate. Probably all three were true at once. Probably no single motivation can account entirely for what he did. What is certain is what he chose, and what that choice meant. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull attributing the disaster to Christian sinfulness. Within 2 years, the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was launched. Saladin would spend the next 5 years fighting Richard to a standstill, and Jerusalem would remain Muslim. But what the Crusaders who came in 1189 found was a city that had been taken mercifully, a church of the Holy Sepulchre still standing, a population that had been allowed to leave, a conqueror who had, by the standards of his age, and perhaps by any age, behaved with dignity. Richard the Lionheart, who never took Jerusalem and who spent 3 years trying, is said to have developed a grudging respect for Saladin that went beyond the conventions of medieval chivalry. The two men never met in person, but their correspondence, recorded in the chronicles, carries something that reads across 8 centuries like genuine mutual regard between two people who understood each other across a war they could not end. Saladin died in 1193, 6 months after signing the treaty with Richard. He had spent his treasury on ransom payments and charitable gifts. When his possessions were counted, he had enough gold to pay for his own funeral and nothing more. The man who took Jerusalem had given it away. Balian of Ibelin lived until 1193, the same year as Saladin. He spent his last years in the reduced kingdom of Jerusalem. Its capital shifted to Acre after the Third Crusade reclaimed the coast, but not the Holy City. The oath he broke, the promise to Saladin that he would not fight, was the pivot on which everything turned. Had he kept it, Jerusalem would have fallen without a defender, without a negotiation, without the threat that made Saladin choose mercy. The city might have fallen in blood, or it might have fallen just as peacefully, without any of the drama. We cannot know. What we know is that a man who promised not to fight chose to fight, and that the man he was fighting against chose, in the end, not to destroy him for it. It is October 2nd, 1187. The gates of Jerusalem are opening.
After 88 years of Crusader rule, the city is changing hands. The great cross on the dome of the rock is coming down. The streets that were full of blood in 1099 are today not. One man made a decision outside the walls. Another man made a decision inside them. History is built, sometimes, on decisions like these, the ones that could have gone the other way, that almost did go the other way, that went the way they did because of the specific character of the specific people who happened to be standing in the specific place at the specific moment. Jerusalem fell. 60,000 people walked out alive. That is not the way cities usually fall. Saladin knew the Third Crusade was coming. He knew Richard the Lionheart was on his way. The battle for everything he had just won was about to begin. The Siege of Acre, where Saladin and Richard fought their first direct confrontation, is next.